We're going to talk about 5 areas today. The first area we're going to talk about is smart race schedule planning. So, it is March. People might have already picked out what they want to do for races this year. Might have already signed up for some races, but it's not too late to potentially make some changes to that race schedule or use this information if you're thinking about a future race schedule. It's critical that if you're trying to achieve some goals that you set up your race schedule in a way that it works for you rather than works against you. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about setting goals that are not only concrete and specific and thus provide good motivation, but are drawn from something very tangible. Oftentimes we run into athletes who pick a goal and they say, and I actually just heard a few people that I talked to this morning, I want to do a half Ironman in under 5:25 this year, or I want to do an Olympic distance in under 2:35. Where did you get that from? Oftentimes those goals might be pulled a little bit out of thin air. We're going to talk about how to use past races, test workouts, and past races, whether they were at the same distance or other distance, to kind of validate your goals, see if they're reasonably planned. We're going to talk about how consistency in training is one of the most important things. We're going to talk about how being really fit does not necessarily mean that you are really healthy, but being really, really, really healthy is critical to becoming as fit as you want to be. And then we're going to talk about the most specific training, the most specific workouts that you can do, no matter what race distance you're racing at, to help you be really prepared for your races. So the key with setting up a race schedule, like I said, is that it sets you up for success. Now that seems obvious, but oftentimes in the off-season, athletes will come to Will or I and say, will you coach me? This is what I want to do. And they're really motivated, really enthusiastic, really passionate, and they say, I want to do my first half marathon, my first half Ironman, I want to do my first marathon, I want to set an Olympic distance PR, and I want to go back and do the first sprint triathlon I did and beat it by 10 minutes. And it's like, okay, wow, I'm glad you want to do so much, and I don't want to do anything to quell that motivation, but we need to set up the race schedule in a way that it's a little bit more focused, and then if we are going for multiple goals, that it's set up in a way that's going to allow you the best chance to reach all those goals. These are 4 common mistakes people make when setting up their race schedule. The one is not identifying any, what Will and I call peak races. So how do you identify a peak race? I say to you, or you say to yourself, what do I really, really, really want to accomplish this year? And you need to be able to answer that question very concretely. You can't be, I want to get faster. I want to do better than last year. It should be something like, I want to do a half Ironman triathlon in under 4 hours and 45 minutes. Or I want to do an Olympic distance triathlon in under 2 hours and 35 minutes. It's very specific, very concrete. Once you know that goal, you can then pick peak races. You'd be shocked how many people set a goal and then they tell you what their big races are, and it's a different distance than what their real goal is. So if we know our goal is 4:30 half Ironman, we now got to pick out a few half Ironmans. Now, a few is a general word there. How many peak races can you have? 1 to 3. Really, no more than 2 unless you're doing a really long season, because they should be separated by at least 2 to 3 months. So typical New England schedule of 2 peak races could be something like in June and something like in late August into September. The only way to really get 3 peak races is if you are talented, fortunate, and have qualified and are doing one of the championship races that are often like in October or November, like the Ironman in Hawaii or the 70.3 championships in Clearwater. Or if you're going to do an early enough race, call it a peak race. It won't be your best race of the year, but maybe do something like March or April, middle of the summer, early fall, separating them by 2 or 3 months. The other thing is your peak races should be very compelling. If it's not a race that you just really, really want to do, it's not going to be a peak race. So for peak races, you need to pick races that are, you love the location. You think the level of competition will really get your juices flowing and make that a potentially really, really good day for you. If it's a race that you think, hey, I kind of want to try that one, that might be a nice one to do, not good for a peak race. That's better for what we call a training race, which is a less important race you do as you're leading up to your peak races. Another common mistake we see people make is once they've identified their peak races, what they want to do for peak races, they don't necessarily pick them at good times of the year for them. As a New Englander, it's very hard to be at your best peak early in the year. Most of us haven't been, well, we've been a little lucky in the last week or so. Typically in March, we haven't been out on our bikes. That might not happen until we get into April or May. Almost never in open water swimming until, say, June 1st or so, maybe May 15th if you are near one of the smaller, warmer ponds. So I always encourage people, just because of weather, to try to set peaks for a little bit later in the year. For another reason, with the ongoing training, we're supposed to get better and better and better. So if you start training for your year on November 1st or December 1st or January 1st, aren't you going to be better 10 months into the year than you are 4 or 5 months into the year? So for that reason, think more time. As a coach, I always love more time to get someone ready for a race. The more time you can give yourself, the more likely you're going to have the success you want at a peak race. And then the other thing to consider as far as timing is your personal schedule. Consider when are you busiest at work? Do you have any personal things coming up in that year? Getting married, having a child, moving to a new house, building a house, anything like that. You should have your peak races at times of the year when you can devote a lot of time and energy to racing. Another common race schedule mistake is simply too many races. Shouldn't exceed the 2 or 3 peak races, and you shouldn't exceed 2 or 3 training races leading up to each peak race. So if you had 2 to 3 peak races and 2 to 3 races leading up to a peak race, that gives you room for 8 to 10 races. So we're not saying don't race at all. We're just saying keep it so that when you get to your peak races, you haven't done so much. A subjective way to tell if you're racing too much or not enough, you get to the end of last season, were you just chomping at the bit to do that last big race? Or were you kind of thinking, I'm kind of ready to do some trail running and kind of mellow out this fall, or I'm kind of ready to go up north and do some skiing? If you're really, really, really in the racing mode still at the end of the season, you're probably on track. If you're feeling a little burnt out, a little tired by the time you get to that peak race at the end of the year, you've probably raced a little bit too much. The last common mistake we see is longer races before peak shorter races. How many people here have run a marathon? A bunch. How about an Ironman? A couple. How about a half Ironman? Okay, a good amount. Especially people who've run marathons. Any of you that think of doing a 5K and you're like, I don't really like that. The 5Ks are really kind of hard, or I don't really go fast at a 5K. Anyone feel that way? Or okay, a couple people. When you start to train for longer distances of races, you lose the ability to have that top end speed. So the last thing you want to do, if your goal is to peak at an Olympic distance race, or if your goal is to peak at a half Ironman, is to do a race longer than that earlier in the year. The build up to an Ironman or the build up to a half Ironman is going to make it really hard for you to be super sharp for that race that's shorter at the end of the year. You're going to have what we call fatigue resistance in spades. You're going to be able to go all day long, but you're not going to have that oomph you need for the shorter distance races. Let's look at a couple examples, and this will make this a little bit more clear. This is a potential race schedule that an athlete might bring to us in the off season and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. So you can see there is an April marathon. Let me back up and say that this person's goals were to run their first marathon, do their first half iron, and set a PR at the Olympic distance. And they said, well, I got an April marathon I can do, and you all kind of all know what that is. That's Boston. So the person's saying, I've got a number, it's local, it's a fun race, why don't I do that as my marathon? My team's doing this half iron in June. Almost everyone on the team's doing it, so why don't I do that one for my peak half iron? And then the first race I ever did was an Olympic distance in September, so I'd love to go there and try to set a PR. So at first glance, this doesn't look too bad. The 3 peak races are pretty well spaced, so that we have going for us. But there's 2 major mistakes. The one is that we have long peak races before we get to short peak races. So this person is going to be training for the half iron distance really all year, and then try to come down and be as fast as she can be for an Olympic distance triathlon at the end of the year. Similarly, probably the hardest endurance sports race among the conventional ones, I'm not talking the really ultra stuff, is a marathon. It takes 2 to 4 weeks after a marathon to be fully recovered. And that means it takes 2 to 4 weeks before you can really start to do a lot of hard training again. So I love the Boston Marathon. I ran the Boston Marathon. I loved the experience. As a triathlon coach, I despise the Boston Marathon. Running the Boston Marathon is really, really hard to do, and then segue yourself into a really sharp triathlon season where you're starting, oftentimes in June. Because look what's going on. The whole second half of April and into May, it's hard for this triathlete to do a lot of hard training. That's when most of us would really start ramping up our cycling. So this triathlete has 2 options after the marathon. Go ahead and cycle a lot and really build up and get ready for that June half Ironman, and risk what? Risk getting injured, risk getting overtrained, risk getting burnt out because she's training hard while she should be recovering from the marathon. Or her second option is to take the recovery from the marathon, not do much riding, get to that June half Iron and be, underprepared. So let's look at a better alternative, keeping most of these same kind of races intact. So what I would suggest to an athlete like this is, let's flip some stuff around. Let's put the marathon after triathlon season, because it's the hardest thing to recover from, and now it's the last race of the year, and we have the off season to recover from. Let's move the half Ironman from June to September. Now, A, it's coming after the Olympic distance race, and B, we've just got 3 more months, including the whole summer, to get ready for it. And the bonus here is this athlete gets a really good shot at her Olympic distance PR without having long distance training in her legs to kind of take the speed out of her body. So this is a much better alternative. We love to see if you want to do marathons or half marathons in a triathlon schedule, either at the very end of the year or nice and early would be another option, to run like a January or February half marathon or marathon. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Will, and he's going to talk about, once you have a schedule, setting your goals really well.